Before we continue, understand this podcast is for adults only and refers to relationships and activities between adults which are voluntary and consensual. If you or anyone you know is being abused, coerced, or violently aggressed against, please reach out for help to the appropriate authorities. To the Gorean Voice podcast. Each week I explore a topic from the Gorean novels which I personally find interesting, or an aspect of living a Gorean inspired, or Gorean adjacent lifestyle here on Earth. Tal, hello, and welcome. Gorean Voice episode 23, Castes on Gore and Castes on Earth. Caste is a word, or rather a concept, with which I've always been uncomfortable. To me, it conjures up images of nearly skeletal day laborers working 12-hour days under the Calcutta sun for a pittance, while Brahmins and British officers feast in luxury. The Mahatma himself described caste as a blight which counted against the argument for home rule. While the Indian caste system is today so widely known that the words Brahmin and untouchable have been thoroughly integrated into the English language, there are a variety of other caste systems which have been in place in many cultures throughout the world. Modern scholarship of the caste phenomenon, whether it be that of the Indian subcontinent or elsewhere in the Old World, has unfortunately become somewhat tainted with post-colonial nationalism. In every case east of the Suez or south of the Med where caste existed, with a possible exception of the samurai to burakumin continuum in Japan, academics argue with a straight face that it was a colonial imposition rather than a genuine cultural phenomenon. Whether this holds true, say, for the caste systems on the Indian subcontinent, or is merely another example of blaming Europeans for any and all aspects of non-European culture which are unflattering, remains to be seen. For now, I'll hold fast to the basic idea of castes in India being ancient, somewhat rigid, and the gold standard for the concept. I should point out, while the notion of caste itself may seem like some piece of ancient history that we simply can't let go of, new caste systems are popping up all the time. Consider the regimes in which people live under the worst political idea of all time, international socialism. In the 20th century in Russia, China, and North Korea, and many other places, new castes of untouchables have been freshly minted, but rather than Dalit, they are called kulaks, or bourgeoisie, or various other hereditary anti-titles, which make them literally into second or third class citizens. Their descendants are officially cursed by the ruling regime, and the severity of the curse ranges from being ineligible for certain government postings to being born and laboring all of one's life under the lash inside of a prison camp. Back to India, though, there are really two types of castes, or they may be thought of as the same idea at two different levels of analysis. The broader caste concept of Varna is the more well known. The castes generally agreed upon are as follows. At the top there is the scholarly and priestly class, called the Brahmins. Below them are the Kshatriyas, the political rulers, administrators, etc. Below them are the Vaishyas, farmers, tradesmen, artisans, etc. And at the bottom are the Shudras, the laboring classes. Of course, there is the Dalit, or untouchable caste, which is under the bottom, though many people who are regarded as Dalit live lifestyles or in subcultures which lie outside of the caste system entirely. From outside of India, this 4+1 system is the most well known, but in people's day-to-day lives, a more fine-grained concept called jati, which has elements of class, tribe, vocation, linguistic and ethnic groups wrapped up within it. There are 4+1 varnas, but thousands of jati. While the notion of caste as something of an analog to class, there is genetic evidence of caste endogamy, that is, marrying within the caste, going back a couple thousand years at least. So the notion of caste mobility is something of an oxymoron. The vocational aspect of caste stems from an era where artisanal mastery carried much more prestige than it does today, and it is this vocational mode of caste that I feel the most affinity with, the castes as described in the Gore novels. Caste on Gore defines several aspects of life. In terms of a basic overview, there are high castes and low castes. High castes are, ranking from high to low, initiates, scribes, builders, physicians, and warriors, and are associated with the colors white, blue, yellow, green, and red, respectively. There are several privileges and responsibilities associated with being of high caste. The one that sticks in my mind most colorfully is the concept of the second knowledge. Low caste people are encouraged to believe that the world is a flat plane or disk, and are not disabused of various other superstitions in order to preoccupy their minds, while high caste people are taught a more accurate cosmology, as well as more information on the nature of the priest-kings and, in some cases, the cur. For those unfamiliar, priest-kings are the giant, sort of insect-looking creatures who actually run the show on Gore and live underground, and the cur are their perennial enemies, giant bear, ape-looking creatures who seek to conquer both Earth and Gore, but for the most part are relegated to living in their steel worlds, that is, large spaceships in the vicinity of the asteroid belt. Now, another privilege of high caste membership is eligibility for certain high offices. A low caste person who has found financial success through enterprise may attempt to buy his way instrumentally into a high caste in order to qualify for some high position or other. This practice generates mixed feelings among Goreans in the books, though such a practice is well attested in the historical, earthly cultures which John Norman took as inspiration for the various cultures on Gore. One earthly example I'm particularly fond of is the practice of wealthy Japanese merchants paying for the privilege to wear a single sword as part of their attire. Not quite the double sword garb of the true bushi or samurai, but let's not get greedy. The earthly process of rendering lands, knighthoods, titles, etc. to commoners who have rendered extraordinary services to the crown has its Gorean analogues as well. As may well be expected, the services rendered column is usually filled in quite thoroughly with violence against the crown's enemies. If this concerns you, best not look too carefully at how the crown itself was established. Among low caste people on Gore, caste itself is not so much a social rank as it is a vocational, guild-like structure. One social taboo, which is enshrined in law in many Gorean cities, is the refusal to practice the art, trade, or profession of one's caste. There are provisions for caste mobility, generally when a candidate shows aptitude for the work of another caste, and such a move may be permitted if a somewhat representative body of membership of his aspirational caste votes him in, or if he is under the tutelage of a sponsor. A few years ago, I penned a reply to a posting on the Gorean Gathering Place FetLife group, which asked the question of whether the concept of caste had any relevance to modern societies. Many of the earlier replies referenced exchanges between castmates in the books, and a few others referred to the deference shown to rank in general. There was plenty of disagreement as well, a healthy argument, which is what we always love to see. I don't believe either of these concepts are particularly relevant to the human experience in 2024, Gorean or not. In contrast, I believe it is the fraternal, guild-like aspect of caste that most speaks to the human experience, and to the tribal past, which some of us pretend not to remember. As such, my reply was as follows. Good morning, gentlemen. I think that the inter-caste hierarchical structure, though important, impresses much less often upon an individual's life than the intra-caste interactions. Perhaps this is my bias showing, as I have a positive disposition towards small, tight groups. Consider the example, on a day-to-day basis, of how much the organizations that I belong to impact my life. At a national level, well, the dorky queen of my country, who wears goofy socks, annoys me a little with government overreach, taxation, and taking some of my favorite things. Sure, I'm not happy about it, but in the day-to-day, there is the provincial government, and the premier of my province, who I think should be chasing ambulances, affects my life a smidge more in the day-to-day, but honestly isn't a huge concern of mine. The mayor of my city, who I think should be selling pencils from a cup outside a train station, determines quite a few matters that affect my day-to-day, and much of the regulation I need to comply with stems from City Hall. Yet I only worry about it maybe once or twice a week. As we get closer and closer to my level, things matter more and more. Various professional organizations, like those of doctors and lawyers, have a vanishingly small impact on my life, except for the couple days of year when I engage them. I would count time spent worrying about what they think of me as a waste. I have a couple of gigs I do. In most cases, there are companies involved, and fraternal organizations, notwithstanding how I feel about unions politically. On a day-to-day basis, I'm much more likely to have a barbecue with colleagues from work, or with my union brothers, with whom I share much more of my daily existence. As such, it is my castmates, and not those who rule over us, who have the biggest impact on my family. Even in the case of the fraternal organizations that are much more intentional, such as my local meetup groups, which are a little political and subversive, as much as we'd like to change the world around and above us, most of our business is internal. In the more Gorean sense, and particularly as it pertains to our womenfolk, most of their world is neatly contained within the group. The actions, thoughts, policies, and opinions of other castes have almost no bearing on our lives, and certainly very little on the lives of our women. As a matter of personal taste, for which I can even articulate a normative rationalization, I like castes, tribes, fraternal organizations, churches, militias, 1%ers, 3%ers, cells, teams, orders, cloisters, tea partiers, radicals, etc., even if I'll never be a member of most of them, and quite a few of them consider me their enemy. There's plenty to dislike about tribalism. My cosmopolitan sensibility rejects so much of it. I see many cases of being born into a caste, tribe, or religion, whether poor or rich, good or bad relative to me, as simple tragedies preventing one from individuating, and in many cases closing the door to enlightenment. But I've had the privilege of battling, both physically and in the realm of ideas, with members of tribes whose beliefs and commitments are antithetical to my own to the point that they wouldn't hesitate to kill me if they had the chance. And yet, some part of me is glad they're there. There's a little magic when my interaction with an LEO goes much more swiftly and positively once he discerns my background and loyalties, signs of which I wear on my hat or as subtle decals on my vehicle's windows. There's something special about when some authority and proximity to a port or a film shoot, of which there are about a gorillion every darn day in my town, grants me an easier passage on account of seeing the handsome heads of thunder and lightning or an IATSE decal in my window. Even the license plate of my vehicle indicates a fraternal organization on account of displaying my ham call sign. Well, it's not exactly a secret handshake. It's fun to get a little wave and a nod from another driver, at the least. Even better, a nice little chat on 146.520 megahertz. The moral of the story? I think the caste of radio amateurs is underrated on the whole. Well, that's the end of my post. A little mirthful. For some context, the handsome heads of thunder and lightning refer to the horses' heads images, which are part of the insignia of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The local which I belong to is heavily associated with the logistical side of the film industry. The IATSE decal on my truck, that's IATSE, contains the insignia for the International Association of Theatre and Stage Employees, and the local to which I belong works on many aspects of the local film industry. A little closer to the camera than the Teamsters, but still on the correct side of it for a man with a face for radio like mine. I mentioned that a part of me is glad they're there, even though in some cases the they are people I'd prefer not to meet in person. As much as I would like to see fewer gangs of outlaws, religious fanatics, etc., I appreciate the aesthetic consequences of there being men who abide codes other than the officially sanctioned ones, and perhaps more importantly, I understand that the tremendous amount of coercive power which a state would require to completely wipe out these final, violent vestiges of atavistic tribalism would come down pretty hard on everyone's head, and make life rather more miserable for everyone, not just the deserving. How about yourself? Does the concept of caste, either the social rank idea or the fraternal and vocational organization idea, does it impinge on your life in any way? If it does it feel like an imposition of our ancestors, or a more recent invention? Like I mentioned earlier, the widely known caste system in India is now believed by some to be something of an Orientalist fantasy, or at the least an Orientalist exaggeration of a genuine phenomenon. But caste appeared everywhere. If you are in a relationship, the concept of caste can certainly be an impediment, especially if the in-laws have strong opinions on the matter. However, differences in social strata, real or imagined, can actually add quite a bit of voltage to one's intimate relationship if used prudently. Of course, I should think so. My wife is my slave girl, and I endorse and proselytize on behalf of this practice. But there are also finer-grained differences that may be employed to add color to the narrative of one's intimate relationship. Does your slave girl originate from a higher socio-economic class than you? All that the better that the princess is now chained at the feet of a barbarian. Is there some ethnic dynamic at work? Don't be afraid to name it and normalize it, at least in the context of your own relationship. Tell her that girls of her background or race or language or hair color or particular university major were put on this earth to, well, you get the idea. In my second favorite city, in my very favorite country, there is a ditty I've been unable to get out of my head this morning. And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and cod, where Lowells speak only to Cabots, and Cabots speak only to God. Even in the country that most personifies the notion of being self-made, its most magnificent city has its very own Brahmin class. Thanks for joining me again this morning, lads. Whether you took her down from an ivory tower, or pulled her up from the jungle, let every beautiful difference between you and your mate forge a new link in the chain. Just make sure you've locked one end to her collar and keep the other end handy for walks. Lasses, see to it that your every task is done with beauty and grace. Take your time to ready and steady yourself. In a future episode, I'll be going into the practice of restraining one's property at night, the maximum security component of living Gorean, whether on Earth or Gore. I'll get into some of the examples from the books, and go into some of the practices I've employed since I started keeping women in steel 24 years ago. However, pray join me again next week, where I'm finally going to take a look at this online role-playing business and see what it's all about. Does a Gorean patriarch have anything to gain by engaging? In the meantime, fair winds and happy trails.